Welcome, everybody. Thank you so much for joining. I'm excited to have you here. Today's program is part of the Presidential Primary Sources Project, and our program today is the Constitution and Presidential Powers, and it's being presented by the National Archives. The Presidential Primary Sources Project is a collaboration between Internet2, the National Archives, and the National Park Service. It's a free series we do every year from January through April. Just a few quick reminders: by participating today, you are agreeing to be recorded and archived. We do keep recordings of all of our programs on our YouTube channel for students and teachers to access later. We're excited to have such a good group, and we want you to participate as much as possible. So just a few reminders about participation. You can absolutely use the chat box, and we will use it a bunch throughout the presentation. So if you haven't found it already, looks like a little caption bubble, go ahead and click on that. Make sure that when you're using the chat box, your display name is what you want it to be. If you want to change it to be your school, or just change it to be however you want us to call on you or give you recognition, you can do that yourself, but you can also leave a chat for me and I will help you rename yourself. There's also the opportunity to be on camera. I see a few of you have left me a chat. I'll work on that in a second. But if you want to be on camera with your classroom, go ahead and also put that in the chat. And once I'm done with my intro, I will help you make that happen. That said, we just want to remind you to be really respectful of all of our ways of interaction. We want you to participate as much as possible, but we also want to make sure any of our comments, questions, thoughts that we're sharing either on video or in the chat are directly related to what our presenter is talking about. And with that, I just want to thank you again for joining us. This is our website. If you are looking to join some of our upcoming programs, which I mentioned go all the way through April, or you're looking to find a recording of today or programs that have already happened, this is where you can do that. And with that, I'm going to go ahead and stop sharing and pass it over to who you came to see. Sarah?
Thank you so much. I'm going to start sharing my screen and we will get started. I'm really excited to be here with all of you today. So thank you. I think we are going to look at some really interesting documents together, and I can't wait to hear what you all think about what we are going to be discussing. So as was mentioned, my name is Sarah Lyons Davis. I am an educator with the National Archives. This is a photo of our headquarters building in Washington, D.C. So I don't know how many of you have been to the National Archives. Maybe you've used National Archives resources before from our website or docsteach.org, but a little bit of background. So the National Archives is an independent federal agency. It was created in 1935, and it preserves and protects the historically valuable records of the United States government. And we make them available to the public. And that part of our mission, making them available to the public, I think is one of the most important things that we do. So what that means is that every document that you're going to see today, you could come and look at in person at the National Archives. You could download for free from our website. There are all different ways of accessing and interacting with them. So when we're talking about government records, we are talking about things created in the past by the government or used in the work of the government. And records can be important government documents like letters, emails, drafts of laws, but they can also be photographs, maps, posters, videos, and more. The National Archives has over 16 billion records, and this number is always growing. And that's billion with a B, so we are talking about a lot of documents. So among these records are important documents that show how and why our government was created. And that includes the Constitution of the United States. So you can see the Constitution here in its case in our rotunda in Washington, D.C. And the Constitution was signed on September 17th, 1787 by 39 delegates. And it was engrossed or written down by a man named Jacob Challis. He was the assistant clerk for the Pennsylvania General Assembly. It took him 40 hours to write it out. He wrote it by hand, and he was paid $30 for his work. And this document was ratified on June 21st, 1788. And we know the Constitution sets up our system of government. And it does that with three branches. So we have the legislative branch. When we think legislative, we want to think Congress. We have the executive branch. When we think executive, we want to think the president, the White House. Then, of course, the judicial branch. With judicial, we think the Supreme Court, the highest court in the land. But each branch has different powers and responsibilities. So today, we are going to specifically look to the Constitution, and we're going to learn more about the powers of the executive branch. And for that, we are going to look to Article 2. So let's get started. So when we look at Article 2, what we want to consider is that it is laying out the job description. So we'll look a little closer at this primary source document to be able to fill in this description by the end of our time together today. So this is the format that we are going to be using. So let's look directly to the source. Oh, I see someone is saying Lakewood Elementary is asking what is an article. So let's go back for a moment to the Constitution. We see this, you can see the article is kind of how the Constitution is divided. So there are different sections of the Constitution, different articles, and each one speaks about a different aspect of governance and the Constitution. And we'll look a little closer at those as we go on, but great question. Thank you for that. So we have our job description we're going to be filling out, and this is our start. We're looking at Article 2, Section 1. And we can see this article states a few different aspects. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to highlight parts of this that we're going to add to our job description. So from this information, we can begin filling out this form with these qualifications to be president. So we'll fill out this first section here. So this article tells us you must be a U.S. citizen, a natural born U.S. citizen. So you must be, what that means is you have to be a citizen at birth. You have to be 35 years of age or older. You have to reside in the United States, a 14-year resident, and the winner of the greatest number of electoral votes. So we have a pretty good start here to what this job entails and what we're looking at. So remember we mentioned the article was modified by amendments. So we're going to use that information to add details to the employment duration section, or how long the employment lasts. So we have our start date, January 20th. In part, the 20th Amendment says, the terms of the President and the Vice President shall end at noon on the 20th day of January. So that's how we get that information that we're adding to our employment duration section. Oh, there's another great question in the chat. Has the start date always been the same? It actually hasn't been. Congress originally set March 4th, 1789 as the start date. And this 4-month gap was needed because of the time it took to count and report votes from the election and to travel to the nation's capital when we didn't have the modern technology and the modern types of transportation we have now. But it was determined that that long period of time really caused a lot of difficulty. So as a result, the 20th Amendment, which was ratified on January 23rd, 1933, moved up Inauguration Day to January 20th, and the first meeting of the new Congress to January 3rd. So that has changed over time. So great question. Thank you for that. That gives us a little more background and information that we can kind of be aware of as we're thinking of this job description. So we also know from the Constitution that the term of the president is 4 years, and there's the option to serve one additional 4-year term pending a successful re-election. And this 4-year term has been in place since our first president. So since George Washington, this has been the rule. However, there are a few additions to be added to this. So that's unless the individual is subject to resignation, so unless they resign or leave the job, or they're removed from office. So these details come from the 22nd Amendment and the 25th Amendment. So we now come to another part of the job description, and that's responsibilities of the presidency. So let's look at some different types of primary sources that illustrate this section of our job description. This is a political cartoon by artist Clifford Berriman, and it's showing us one of these very important responsibilities. So let's look at this together. So I'll ask you guys what you think about this. What do you notice first in this political cartoon? Any labels or details that jump out at you? Yeah, so Lakewood Elementary is saying he's at the White House. We have someone else in the chat is noticing the Capitol is in the background. Oh, you guys are doing amazing. We see someone else saying he's ringing a doorbell. And people are noticing the labels. It says OK House, OK Senate. Someone else is identifying this this creature, I guess, as a scroll. And we have yet another person who says they think it's a railroad bill. And I would agree. We see that label on the scroll's lapel says railroad bill. We can see he's already been approved by the House. He's been approved by the Senate. And he is ringing the doorbell to the White House. So I see Edgewood Elementary has a guess at what is happening and what we're seeing. I'll give it a moment if anyone else wants to take an idea at what you think we're seeing in action. We can look at the emotion on this Bill's face too. What do you think? Do you think he looks confident? Do you think he looks worried, surprised? Yeah, he looks a little unsure, right? Anxious, we have some people saying. Yeah, and so we see this in the chat. A lot of you all are totally identifying what this is. This is a bill on its way to becoming a law. So we see that this railroad bill has already been approved by the House and the Senate, and he's now at the White House to see what the president is going to do. So let's look. So Congress wanted to pass this bill, so they wanted the president to approve it. If not, it goes back to Congress, and they would need a 2/3 vote in favor to pass it by overriding the president's veto. So let's go back to our Constitution, and we can see this in action, this idea of Article 1, Section 7. From this transcript, we see the president can sign or veto bills. So let's read the text of this together. It says, every bill which shall have passed the House of Representatives and the Senate shall, before it become a law, be presented to the President of the United States. If he approve, he shall sign it, but if not, he shall return it, with his objections to that House in which it shall have originated, who shall enter the objections at large on their journal and proceed to reconsider it. So we get a little more information about this. And yeah, we're looking at Article 1, Section 7 of the Constitution. You guys are doing a great job with this. So let's look at this document together to see part of this responsibility in action. I'm going to put up these document analysis questions again on the screen so that we have them in mind. And these are questions you want to really keep in mind when you're looking at any primary source document It just helps you learn a little bit more and consider what you're seeing and what we may be thinking. So let's zoom in a little bit. Let's see if we can answer any of these questions. Can anyone see when is this document from? Do you find a date? Yeah, great job. So people are saying 1965, definitely. And who made this document? Who do you think is the author? Yes, I see our friends in the chat. We got a lot of answers of Congress, and we do see that it's 89th Congress of the United States of America. So an additional question, who do you think received this document? And we can look at some additional details to learn that too. Yeah, people are saying the president or the White House, definitely. And we see on this stamp here too, it says White House. So that's a good clue. Anyone want to take a guess? What do you think this document is talking about? Can you see that on the document? Yeah, it's an act. And let's read below it together. It's an act to enforce the 15th Amendment of the Constitution. So you might remember the 15th Amendment states it's the right of the citizens of the United States to vote shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or any state on account of race, color, or previous condition of servitude. So we're talking about an act to enforce the 15th Amendment. This is speaking about voting rights. So this act that we are looking at outlawed the discriminatory voting practices adopted in many southern states after the Civil War. These included literacy tests or poll taxes as a prerequisite to voting. So a little bit of background information. Let's look now at the next page of this document. So can you guys tell from this who signed this document? Can you make out those signatures with whose names those might be? What do you, I saw someone said LBJ. So it's, yeah, we have someone also notices it's the vice president, and the vice president's name at that point is Hubert Humphrey. So we do see that, and it's also signed by Lyndon B. Johnson as the president and John W. McCormick as the Speaker of the House of Representatives. So great job seeing those details. And so I want to show you, this is a photo of President Lyndon B. Johnson signing the Voting Rights Act. And we see some people observing his signatures. You may recognize some of the people observing. We include some civil rights leaders here as well. So this is another part of the responsibility that we see when we look back to the Constitution and Article 1, Section 7. So this also tells us, oh, I'm sorry, someone is saying in the chat, they notice Martin Luther King Jr. Yes, I see him too. He is included right there. So he is observing LBJ signing this Voting Rights Act. Great observations. I love how you're all looking closely at these documents. So from these acts, we know a president has veto power. With a 2/3 vote, however, the House can override a presidential veto. So while the word veto does not appear in the Constitution, the power of the president to refuse to sign legislation is clearly outlined in the Constitution. So we see this document. It's an attempted override of President Richard Nixon's veto of S 518, an act to abolish the offices of the director and deputy director of the Office of Management and Budget. So I'm not sure how big this is on your screens, but can anyone find a year on this document? Yeah, 1973. So that gives us kind of a moment in time where we are. We are in 1973. And we also have President Nixon's explanation for his veto. And so I highlighted some of these in the blue boxes as well, the sections I'm going to reference. So Nixon referred to the deeply rooted constitutional principle of separation of powers. And President Nixon explains he's exercising the veto because S 518 would violate that separation by removing two executive officers from their position. So he maintains that the presidential power to remove executive officers is an exclusive power that cannot be infringed upon by Congress. So, does anyone know the phrase for what Nixon might be referring to? So, that relationship between the three branches of government. What do those three branches do for each other? Yeah, checks and balances. Thank you. And balance of power. Absolutely. So we see that reference, we see it in action through the work of the government, but we also see Nixon referencing that in his reasoning. And I saw there was a question, do vetoes happen a lot? I'm not really sure that percentage in which vetoes happen. We do see them happen time to time. But that would be something really interesting to look up to know if, like, what the average percentage of how often the president uses veto power happens. I'm not sure. That's a great question. And so we see this happen here with a 2/3 vote. The House overrides Nixon's veto. Can you locate the word resolved? So when you locate that word, you see it says that the said bill pass with 2/3 of the senators present having voted in the affirmative. So that's this process that we're seeing in action, this override of the presidential veto. And when we look at the document from the House of Representatives, we can locate the word resolved again. And we see here it says that said bill do not pass. 2/3 of the House of Representatives not agreeing to pass the same. So the framers of the Constitution gave the president the power to veto acts of Congress to prevent the legislative branch from becoming too powerful. So this is an illustration of that separation of powers integral to the US Constitution. By separating the powers of government into three branches and creating this system of checks and balances between them, the framers hoped to prevent the misuse of the abuse of power. So this veto allows the president to check the legislature by reviewing acts passed by Congress and blocking measures he finds unconstitutional, unjust, or unwise. So Congress's power to override the president's veto forms this balance between the branches on the lawmaking power. So we see this as really the branches working together. So we've been working through these document analysis questions along the way. I just want to put them on the screen as a reminder of what we want to be asking when we look at these primary sources, like we're doing together today. So the Constitution also gives the president the power to make treaties. Let's look a little closer at one together now. And we're going to zoom in a little more too, because I want you to be able to actually read the document. So there we go. Once again, can anyone find the date? Yeah, September 24th, 1963. And where is this document coming from? What do you think? Yeah, the Senate. Does anyone remember what branch of government we think of when we think of the Senate? Legislative. Awesome job, guys. So I'm again going to highlight part of this, and I want us to focus on the text inside that red box. So this is referring directly back to that section of the Constitution we were discussing. And we can see, here we go, it says, whereas the Constitution in Article 2, Section 2 provides, and then it goes on to quote it. So this Constitution, this action in the Constitution is being referenced directly from this document. And this multilateral treaty was signed in Moscow by the United States, Great Britain, and the Soviet Union. And after Senate approval, the treaty went into effect on October 10, 1963, and it banned nuclear weapons testing in the atmosphere, in outer space, and underwater. So you can see a photo here of President John F. Kennedy signing the treaty. Does anyone recognize another individual we talked about earlier today in this photo? So yeah, MLK is a good guess. Over here we see Lyndon B. Johnson. Yeah, LBJ, I see in the chat some people are mentioning. So great job, guys. So we look back to this Article 2, Section 2, we see that treaty power. Again, all filling out that job description we are creating for the presidency. So through this article, we see he, so he is referring to the president here, shall have power by and with the advice and consent of the Senate to make treaties provided 2/3 of the senators present concur. So again, we're seeing the treaty making power, but we're also seeing this checks and balances. And we see this demonstrated in presidencies from the early republic too. So this is a treaty of peace and amity between the United States and Great Britain. And it was signed on December 24th, 1814. It ended the War of 1812, and that was fought between Great Britain and the United States. So we see this throughout American history. So we still have some more duties to include in our job description. So I want to look at some other documents as well. So we'll take a look at some photos and see what they tell us. Oh, I see one person in the chat has already identified the individual in the blue suit in this image. So other people, so we do see former President George W. Bush. We see he's the man in the suit here. People are saying they see soldiers, they see the president saluting the troops. There's a question if he is giving a speech. I'm not sure if he's giving a speech. The caption on the photo tells us, it says, George W. Bush turning towards the audience and waving on his visit to Marine Corps Base, Camp Lejeune in North Carolina. So he may have given a speech while he was there, but I don't know. We can't really tell from that photo. And he is in North Carolina. In this image, we had a question of where the president was, and this photo is from 2003. So let's look at an earlier photo that has some similarities though. So what people or objects or activities do you see here? Yeah, several of the schools have identified that that is President Abraham Lincoln in the middle, that gentleman with the top hat. And we're also seeing some photos of the Army. Soldiers, yeah, and someone else is pointing out it's Lincoln and Union soldiers. Absolutely right. So after the Civil War Battle of Antietam, President Abraham Lincoln was anxious for Major General George B. McClellan to pursue Confederate General Robert E. Lee's army into Virginia. And McClellan believed this army was not fit to move. So Lincoln unexpectedly visited McClellan and his army to observe its condition. So this photo is from October 3rd, 1862, and it was photographed by a famous photographer, Alexander Gardner, and he photographed Lincoln and McClellan at the 5th Corps headquarters. Yeah, so we see this military camp. Great job looking at these details, everyone. So when we take everything we've learned about these photos and we go back to the Constitution, we can look at this Article 2, Section 2, and we see the President shall be Commander-in-Chief of the Army and Navy of the United States and of the militia of the several states. So what we're seeing in these photos is the President fulfilling his duties as the Commander-in-Chief. And yes, all of these articles that we're seeing are from the Constitution. So the Commander-in-Chief is the person who is ultimately makes the ultimate decision and is from in charge of these parts of different departments of the military. So Army, Navy, all of that kind of thing. So great questions, guys. I really appreciate these thoughtful questions that you're asking and the connections you're making with what you're seeing. And I think we're seeing what a vast and complex job it is to be the President of the United States. So we're now going to look at a group of similar types of documents that illustrate yet another presidential responsibility. So from this document, what do you think it is that we're seeing? I know it may be hard to read in the cursive, but give it a try if you can, and we can read it together if that's helpful. Yeah, so I see in the chat, some of the schools are asking if it's a nomination. It is a nomination. So it says, Gentlemen of the Senate, I nominate for the Department of the Treasury of the United States. Then it goes on to list several people. I see some of our friends in the chat have recognized that first name is Alexander Hamilton of New York is being nominated as the secretary. So after taking office as the nation's first president, George Washington appointed his cabinet. On September 11th, 1789, he nominated Alexander Hamilton as secretary for the Department of the Treasury. Yeah, and I see in the chat some of the schools also are recognizing some of these other names as well. So we do see these names, and you may be familiar with them from your study of the early republic and 18th century American history. So what about this one? This is a little more modern, if you will, of a nomination. So where is this document coming from? Who made this document? Yeah, I see someone identified the year. So this is March 4th, 1933. Awesome job. So we have people in the chat saying it's coming from the president or the White House. Definitely. Who is it addressed to? So who is President Roosevelt sending it to? Yeah, he's sending it to the Senate of the United States. And we know this is a nomination. So I'm going to zoom in just a little bit more. Who is being nominated and for what role? Yeah, Frances Perkins is being nominated to be the Secretary of Labor. Great job. So President Franklin D. Roosevelt notified the U.S. Senate on March 4th, 1933, that he had nominated Frances Perkins of New York to be the Secretary of Labor. She was confirmed in this position, and she became the first woman appointed to a cabinet position. She was the longest-serving labor secretary. She served for 12 years, between 1933 and 1945. She was also the first woman to enter the presidential line of succession. And this is a photo of Frances Perkins that you can see here. So our next document is going to look at a slightly different type but similar first with this nomination. So can anyone see from this document who President Ronald Reagan is nominating and for what job? What do we think? Yes, I see some people are saying that it relates to the Supreme Court. Yeah, and he's nominating Sandra Day OConnor to be an Associate Justice of the Supreme Court. Great job. So during President Ronald Reagan's, well, he wasn't president yet, but during Ronald Reagan's 1980 campaign for president, he promised to nominate a woman for the Supreme Court. And President Reagan followed through on this pledge on August 19, 1981, by nominating Arizona State Court of Appeals Judge Sandra Day OConnor. The U.S. Senate confirmed OConnor on September 22, 1981. So OConnor was the first woman nominated to this position, and her appointment garnered unanimous Senate approval. So that means everyone agreed in the Senate. And she served 24 terms on the Supreme Court before her retirement in 2006. So I see a question in the chat. Yes, she was the first woman on the Supreme Court, appointed to the Supreme Court. So we go back again to look at another section of this article. He, the president, shall nominate. And so we see these nomination powers of the president. When we have really discovered a lot from this article of the Constitution, but there is still more. And this document from 1848 illustrates that. So let's zoom in to focus on a section of it. So I know this may be a little hard to read with the cursive here. So I can pull up a transcript as well. So I know this is a lot of text also, so we are just going to go into one section. Oh, Lakewood is asking, how did they write so straight? So that is a great question. And let me go back so we can see this full document here. So remember, there wasn't that same type of kind of easy word processors or computers that we had today. So there was printing, but in terms of these documents, which would be done kind of through the course of work and a little quicker, we do see them handwritten. So that is really a formal style that we don't see as much today. We're maybe not as familiar with writing in this way today. So it is really cool to look at this document, not just for the information in it, but when we look at the actual physical document, we can examine it as an artifact as well. I think part of that is the straight lines of the writing and the different style of cursive. So yeah, these are all just kind of stylistic aspects of this document, but they're really great to observe when we're looking at primary sources because they all tell us part of this larger story. So thank you for those questions. So we're going to look here just at this one section of the document, and we've lined it up with the transcript. So looking at this, what do you think is being discussed here? Great job. So we see in the chat, the school Lakewood Elementary is saying that they're seeing a pardon. Oh, and Edgewood Intermediate has a great question. Why do a lot of the paragraphs start with whereas? So again, this is a different style, kind of a historical style that we see in a lot of these documents, and particularly in the style of writing official documents like we would have with a presidential pardon. Yeah, we see this phrase, an unconditional pardon. So great job. So what does this tell us about the job of the president? Let's once again return to Article 2, Section 2. We see the president can grant a pardon. And a pardon is granting a reprieve or forgiving an offense. So the president shall have the power to do this. So we have made it to the last section of our job description. You guys have done an amazing job. These are examples of executive orders from a president. So again, let's look a little closer with our document analysis questions. So what do you think we are looking at here? This is kind of a tricky one, so we can go through this together if we need to. Yeah, so we see in the chat people are identifying, we see President Eisenhower, we see it's related to something happening in Arkansas. Oh, there's a question if there were people protesting. So this did involve some protests that were going on. So let me go a little closer. So President Dwight D. Eisenhower was enforcing school desegregation laws. So that means he was making sure that they were being followed and were put into effect. So this executive order signed by President Dwight D. Eisenhower sent federal troops to maintain order and peace while the integration of Central High School in Little Rock, Arkansas took place. On May 17, 1954, the U.S. Supreme Court had ruled in Brown versus Topeka Board of Education that segregated schools were inherently unequal, and they ordered that U.S. public schools be desegregated, and they said with all deliberate speed. So within a week of this 1954 decision, Arkansas was one of 2 southern states to announce it would begin immediately to take steps to comply with the Brown decision. And Congressman Brooks Hayes and Little Rock Mayor Woodrow Mann asked the federal government for help. So they asked first in the form of U.S. Marshals. And President Dwight D. Eisenhower, as the chief law enforcement officer of the United States, this is one of his duties as president, he was presented with a difficult problem. He was required to uphold the Constitution and the laws, but he also wanted to avoid a violent confrontation in Arkansas. So with this executive order 10730, the president placed the Arkansas National Guard under federal control, and he sent 1,000 U.S. Army paratroopers from the 101st Airborne Division to assist them in restoring order in Little Rock. So we see these actions from the job description and from the Constitution taking place throughout American history. And we can look to the Constitution, this Article 2, Section 3 says, he, or the president, shall take care that the laws be faithfully executed. So that is what we are seeing here in action. So let's look back to our responsibilities. We see these responsibilities include, we can read these together, sign bills into law or veto bills, make treaties, serve as commander-in-chief of the armed forces, nominate certain officials, grant reprieves and pardons, take care that the laws be faithfully executed. So we have our full job description. And our additional requirements include taking an oath of office. Anyone recognize the president's taking the oath here? Yeah, we see former President Obama. Oh, great. And Birchwood is mentioning they also recognize former President Ford, as does Edgewood. Nice job. So we see President Obama and President Ford. And this is the inauguration of former President Ulysses S. Grant. And so another requirement that we see in this presidency is providing a State of the Union address. And this is a photograph. We see former President Jimmy Carter presenting his State of the Union speech to Congress in 1979. And again, we look to the Constitution to spell out these requirements, and we see that State of the Union requirement being listed here. He shall from time to time give to the Congress information of the State of the Union. So we have our full job description now. So what do you all think? Do you think this is a job you might want someday? So you see some folks are saying yes, that's great. Other people are saying it looks hard and no thank you. I think it is a very hard job. As we saw, there's a lot that goes into it. So we have people in Edgewood saying most say no, some say yes. So it seems like we're pretty split. But I would say, just judging from how well you all did with looking at these documents and the connections and analysis you made, I think you would do really well. I think you're up for it. And all of these documents are documents from the National Archives. So, well, thank you guys so much for going through all of these examples with me. You really have done an amazing job. I'm so impressed, and I'm happy to answer any questions you might have too.
All right. Do we have any questions before we sign off? Bye, Edgewood. All right. Well, if we don't have any other questions, I just want to thank you, Sarah, for your time and sharing all your knowledge. And for everyone who came, thank you so much for joining. And we hope to see you again. Have a great afternoon, everybody. Bye.
Bye. Thank you.